20 years ago, the EU imagined itself as a future superpower. Today, critics accuse that it negotiates as a supplicant. Power is not just about weight, it's about direction, coherence, the ability to act when the window is open. Systems that hesitate in those moments may not collapse. They risk becoming a spectator in a story they were meant to shape. Welcome to Global Risk Profile, where we don't just follow the headlines, we ask what they mean. Behind every conflict, every crisis, and every turning point, there is a deeper logic at work. Our goal isn't to tell you what to think, it's to help you see more clearly what actually works, what doesn't, and why it matters. In late July, the European Union signed a new trade agreement with the United States. President Trump called it the biggest deal ever made. The deal was presented as a win-win, but in policy circles it was viewed as a win for the US and a concession by the EU. The EU agreed to a flat 15% tariff on all goods it exports to the US, a higher rate than the recently finalized UK deal of 10%. In return, the EU would maintain zero tariffs on American exports to Europe, while the EU committed to importing $750 billion worth of US energy, semiconductors, and industrial goods over 5 years. Tariffs on steel and aluminum still 50%. Brussels framed the agreement as a necessity, an act of pragmatism in volatile times. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen acknowledged that Trump was known as a tough negotiator and dealmaker, adding that the deal will bring stability, it will bring predictability, both of which she said were essential for businesses across the Atlantic. When asked whether the 15% tariff was acceptable for European automakers, she replied bluntly, 15% is not to be underestimated, but it is the best we could get. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz welcomed the deal, mainly because it avoided needless escalation with the United States, even while he acknowledged that the remaining tariffs would hit Germany's export-driven economy hard, noting that a better outcome was simply not achievable under the current circumstances. But the tone across much of Europe was muted. In Belgium, Prime Minister Bart de Wever called it a moment of relief, but not of celebration, a view echoed by Foreign Minister Maxime Prevot, who emphasized that while uncertainty ended, the result is not an agreement we can applaud. In Paris, European Affairs Minister Benjamin Haddad struck a sharper tone. The deal offered only temporary stability and was functionally unbalanced. And in Budapest, Prime Minister Viktor Orban put it bluntly, Trump ate Ursula von der Leyen for breakfast. A vivid image for what many across Europe perceived as a negotiated capitulation. Meanwhile, veteran British journalist Andrew Neil, not known for sentimentality, noted with a touch of schadenfreude, what is not in doubt is that the UK, now unshackled from Brussels, managed to negotiate a far better trade deal with the Trump administration than the EU could. 20 years ago, the EU imagined itself as a future superpower. Today, critics accuse that it negotiates as a supplicant. For many observers, the story wasn't just about tariffs or trade balances. It was about leverage, power, and posture. How did a bloc of 27 nations, home to 450 million people and immense economic might, arrive at a point where the best it could get was still a seeming loss? This episode isn't about one trade deal. It's about what that moment revealed, about Europe's structure, its negotiation power, and the long arc of strategic drift that brought it here, and the power it could have had. The idea of a united Europe wasn't born in secrecy. Jean Monnet, one of the European project's earliest architects, laid it out as early as 1943. He said, "There will be no peace in Europe if the states are reconstituted on the basis of national sovereignty." He said further, "Prosperity and social progress will only be possible if they form a federation or European entity that makes them into a common economic unit." In other words, a peaceful, prosperous Europe would require something stronger than cooperation between sovereign states. It would require political union. But after World War II, rather than a public constitutional process like America's founding, Europe's leaders opted for gradual integration through treaties, institutions, and functional necessity. That wasn't necessarily hidden. In fact, it was discussed openly, just not always with the public. When citizens pushed back, the integration strategy shifted again. After the French and Dutch voters rejected the proposed EU constitution in 2005, the text was reworked as the Lisbon Treaty, stripped of its symbolic reference to an anthem, flag, and constitution, and passed largely through parliaments. Even Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the architect of the original constitution, remarked, "The difference between the original constitution and the present Lisbon Treaty is that the latter is presented in a different way. But in terms of content, the proposals remain practically unchanged." This is what came to be known as integration by stealth. Not a conspiracy, but a method. Integration through elite consensus, layered institutions, and incremental steps, often insulated from direct democratic input. The result today is a European Union that sits uneasily between intergovernmental cooperation and federal union. Two overlapping layers of governance with unclear divisions of authority, and a central layer in Brussels that feels distant to many of the bloc citizens. When the United States ratified its constitution in 1787-88, it did so through a fiercely public state-by-state process. Every state had to debate, persuade, and vote. The Federalist Papers weren't abstract essays. They were targeted campaigns to win over skeptical citizens, arguing that ceding limited powers to a federal government would ultimately secure their freedoms and interests. No ratification, no union. The result was a federation forged not just by elite vision, but by grassroots consent. Its legitimacy and its resilience rested on public buy-in. By contrast, Europe's supranational integration has largely proceeded through executive negotiation and bureaucratic layering. Without that mandate, even well-functioning institutions may struggle to inspire loyalty when the road gets rough. We'll explore the consequences of this structure in the next segment, how it shaped the EU's ability or inability to respond to crises, and what it means for Europe's global role. The problem with being neither here nor there isn't just philosophical, it's strategic. In a world where crises erupt overnight, pandemics, energy shocks, trade wars, military aggression, governments must act fast, with clarity and authority. The European Union, as currently structured, often can't. Its institutional design is deliberative by nature, distributed by necessity, and divided by design. Member states retain sovereignty over core domains like defense, taxation, and foreign policy, while Brussels holds regulatory authority over the internal market, environmental standards, and trade negotiations. The result is a machine that works well under stable conditions, but strains under pressure. As crises accumulated, from the Eurozone collapse to Russia's war on Ukraine, the weakness of that model was laid bare. Take defense. The EU has talked about strategic autonomy for over a decade, but still relies heavily on the US through NATO. Defense budgets are fragmented, procurement systems incompatible, and decision-making remains national. Even after the Ukraine invasion, coordination has lagged behind urgency. Energy policy showed similar faults. Europe's over-reliance on Russian gas was well known, but the ability to act collectively, whether on diversification, joint gas purchases, or infrastructure, proved limited when it mattered most. Trade too reveals the structural limits. Though the EU can negotiate as a bloc, internal divergence often delays or weakens deals. The recent transatlantic trade negotiations left Europe on worse terms than the UK. A reminder that even when Brussels speaks for the bloc, it often lacks the executive agility or political backing to act with force in fast-moving, high-risk settings. Even supporters of Europe's intergovernmental model acknowledge the risk. The core challenge was not hidden, it was a known gamble. Some hoped incremental integration would continue peacefully until a federation is formed. Others believed the very crisis the structure couldn't handle might one day force a deeper union. And so, the question isn't merely whether Europe can reform, but whether its current design can survive in a world that won't wait. The EU's institutional fragility isn't just an internal problem, it is a strategic opportunity for others. Over time, the world's major powers have learned that the EU, for all its economic weight, is often not a single actor. It is 27 partially aligned players with overlapping rules and sometimes conflicting aims. And that reality, its slow response, its internal tensions, its unclear lines of authority, can be used. The result isn't always dramatic. It's more often incremental. Leverage here, delay there, sidestep consensus when it matters most. And over the years, China, Russia, the United States, and more recently Middle Eastern powers have all done exactly that. Let's start today. In the recent trade negotiations, the US offered the EU harsher terms than the UK, because it could. Former US officials and trade lawyers have acknowledged that Washington prefers to deal directly with the capitals that matter most to its interests, whether it's Berlin, Paris, or Warsaw. So they basically deal with the EU when it's better for them, and they deal with individual countries when it's better for them. This logic isn't new. During the Iraq War in 2003, the Bush administration openly bypassed EU consensus. France and Germany objected to the invasion, but the US formed a coalition of the willing by engaging directly with Poland, the Czech Republic, and others. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld even coined the term New Europe to contrast the newer, pro-American governments with the older, more skeptical powers. The strategy was clear: divide the EU to neutralize opposition. Russia, too, has played this game well. Through energy diplomacy in the 1990s and 2000s, Moscow secured bilateral gas deals with countries like Germany, while cutting supplies to others like Ukraine. This created a system of asymmetric dependencies, where some EU countries were afraid to cross Russia and others bore the costs of confrontation. A common energy policy was impossible under such conditions. Even Nord Stream 1, signed in 2005, was a bilateral pipeline deal between Russia and Germany, negotiated without Brussels. It deepened divisions within the EU, just as Eastern states warned the dependency on Russian gas was a strategic mistake. In more recent years, Russia has used newer tactics to exploit the EU's weaknesses. During the pandemic, Moscow offered Sputnik V vaccines to Hungary and Slovakia before they were approved by the European Medicines Agency, undermining the bloc's coordinated vaccine rollout and stoking distrust between capitals. In 2021, Belarus, with clear Kremlin support, began funneling migrants from the Middle East toward the EU's borders, weaponizing humanitarian flows to provoke crisis in Poland and Lithuania. Brussels responded slowly, once again hampered by disagreement and delay. This provoked Poland to react quickly and seemingly against EU directives and policy. China has followed a similar arc: first trade and then influence. After joining the WTO in 2001, Beijing quickly learned that the EU's internal divisions on trade enforcement could be exploited. Germany wanted market access. Southern states wanted protections. Brussels often failed to act decisively on subsidies or dumping. The result: strategic delays, legal ambiguity, and a growing trade imbalance. Then came the next phase: divide and invest. By the late 2000s, China was already laying the groundwork for what would become the 17+1 initiative. Bilateral outreach to Central and Eastern European states, offering infrastructure deals and political engagement outside of Brussels' framework. The goal wasn't just trade, it was influence, and it worked. In 2017, Greece, having received substantial Chinese investment in its port infrastructure, blocked a joint EU statement condemning China's human rights record at the United Nations Human Rights Council. The EU, for the first time, failed to speak with one voice on a major global issue because one member dissented. Italy, too, stepped outside EU consensus when it became the first G7 country to join China's Belt and Road Initiative in 2019, signing memoranda that gave Beijing symbolic and practical access into European infrastructure planning, undermining attempts at a unified EU approach to strategic investment screening. Then Italy was hit hardest during the pandemic and has in recent years done an about-face. In the Middle East, a new pattern has emerged. Countries like the UAE and Qatar have learned to bypass Brussels entirely, cultivating deep ties with individual EU members through arms sales, energy contracts, and cultural diplomacy. France, for example, has supported UAE-aligned factions in Libya despite official EU efforts to remain neutral and enforce an arms embargo. Qatar, ahead of the 2022 World Cup, leveraged energy deals with Germany and Italy to soften EU-wide criticism on labor abuses, again proving that with the right incentives, EU unity is elastic. In each of these cases, trade, energy, health, diplomacy, external actors didn't need dirty tricks or covert interference. They simply understood something Europe forgets, that the bloc's real authority lies not in Brussels, but in its capital cities. Over time, US administrations, Chinese strategists, and Russian diplomats learned the same lesson. That is the practical downside of the EU model. Enforcement power without enforcement backbone. Regulatory clout, but little capacity to enforce or deter. As Timothy Garton Ash warned in 2000, writing, Europe's drive toward unification threatens just the opposite, disunity. This isn't just missed opportunity. It's constructive erosion of strategic standing. When power is dispersed, delayed, and doubted, adversaries don't wait, they move in. The European Union was meant to be something more than just a club of states. And for decades, it moved in that direction through slow institution layering. The problem is that structure isn't neutral. It amplifies some capacities and weakens others. And in Europe's case, the model it built, deliberative, layered, and often distant, turned out to be well suited to rule-making under calm conditions, but poorly suited to decision-making under pressure. And that gap hasn't just cost Europe, it cost the world. Would China's strategic rise over the past 3 decades have gone so uncontested if the EU had been a global actor with real geopolitical weight? Would Russia have deepened its military alignment with Beijing if Europe had projected more than regulation? Would the first Iran nuclear deal, crafted with heavy EU involvement, have been so easily circumvented? When Europe doesn't show up as a pillar of power, others shape the order without it, and sometimes against it. This is not unlike what we see in business. Think of a subsidiary owned by a large conglomerate. In theory, it should have the best of both worlds: the resources and stability of a corporate giant and the nimbleness of a local operator. Some Berkshire Hathaway companies manage to strike that balance. But in many other cases, it becomes the worst of both worlds. Corporate headquarters micromanage what it doesn't understand, while local managers feel disempowered to lead. The result isn't catastrophe, it's drift, underperformance, missed opportunity. And when a crisis hits, nobody is quite sure who is in charge or how quickly they are allowed to act. Europe's structure mirrors that dilemma. Its institutions are elaborate, its ambitions grand, and it has enormous capacity. But in moments of crisis, when trade patterns shift, when energy is weaponized, or when allies recalibrate, the system often blinks. Not because of bad intent, but because power is blurred and accountability is diluted. That's not just a European issue. The United States became resilient not simply because it federated, but because it also persuaded. Every state had to ratify the Constitution. The people had to be sold on it. Power had to be earned, not presumed. The EU never quite managed that, and history is not pausing to let it figure that out. The tide that once carried globalism and supranational structures to prominence is now receding. Sovereignty is back. The age of cosmopolitan assumptions has given way to new realism, where voters, leaders, and even former integrationists are now reclaiming the language of borders, autonomy, and strategic clarity. And timing matters. Systems don't get infinite chances. There are windows, moments, when the cosmic climate aligns for bold change. The Euro, the Schengen Zone, the Lisbon Treaty, These were all forged in windows of relative optimism and calm. But the current climate is different, more fragmented, more adversarial, and more skeptical of centralized authority. That's what makes the current trajectory so costly, and that's the lesson. Power is not just about weight, it's about direction, coherence, the ability to act when the window is open and to know whose hand is on the lever. Systems that hesitate in those moments may not collapse, but they risk something subtler. They risk becoming a spectator in a story they were meant to shape. Europe still has the weight, but clarity is what turns weight into force. What we've explored in this episode isn't just about Brussels, tariffs, or diplomacy. It's about what happens when structure lags behind ambition, when legitimacy isn't refreshed, when unity is assumed but not reaffirmed, and when no one is quite sure who's meant to act until it's already too late. That's it for this episode of Global Risk Profile. If you found this useful, thoughtful, or just different, please subscribe, share, and leave a review. Remember, the headlines may change, but the deeper patterns rarely do. Thanks for listening, and stay sharp.